Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting to order and acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Dakota peoples, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Treaty 3 territory. On the panel today, joining via Zoom, are Ms. Carrie Linklater and Mr. Ron Merritt. Our assessor today is Mr. Nathan Kupfer, and our administrative person is Ms. Fran Picoto. My name is Bill Moretsky, also on the panel, and will be chairing this hearing. We will be hearing applications for revision of the assessment roll in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested have been described in each application, and we will limit discussion to those matters. The statements that are made at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Be advised that comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the Board of Revision. The Board of Revision is appointed annually by Council and is independent of it and the City Administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order that will be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or to the Court of King's Bench if the matter pertains to the application of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included with the board's order. With respect to the hearing process, I will confirm the points of appeal with your property to be addressed with each applicant following the swearing in. We will then have the assessor's testimony followed by questions that the applicant may have, and then the applicant's testimony followed by questions. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they wish. Once all of the evidence about an application has been brought forward, the applicant may leave. The process will repeat for each item on the docket today. The session will close after all the applications have been heard, and the board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You will receive the board's decision by registered mail as soon as possible. As information, all public hearings are live streamed, recorded, and will be part of the public record. We will be hearing items 1 to 8 on our docket today. Ms. Picoto, please affirm the assessor's and the applicant's testimony.
Mr. Assessor, please state your full name.
Nathan Kupfer.
Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Mr. Applicant?
Mark Newman.
Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Okay, we will begin with our first item on the docket, number 1. This is a property on Pioneer Avenue, file number 24-3230. Mr. Kupfer, would you please begin your presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you said, file number 24-3230. The roll number is 1209-753-0700, and the street address is simply Pioneer Avenue. This property is owned by CNR, Canadian National Rail. It's a surface parking lot. The total land area combined is 19,659 square feet. And we have a 2025 modeled assessment using the income approach of $1,129,000, which I'm going to recommend be confirmed today. Scrolling down to page 2 and 3 of my brief, I provided photos and some maps of the subject property. As you can see, we have no recent sales on the property. So this is actually 4 non-contiguous pieces of land that all kind of border along the sides and underneath of the railway, which is going around the baseball diamond. So you can see by my photo on page 2. And then on page 3, you can get another view of these four smaller parcels, which make up one property here. Page 4 of my brief includes some rent comparables. So again, we'll use the income approach on this property. So we've provided some parking comparables for your reference. Admittedly, these parking comparables are pretty all over the map here. We range from a low of about $41.50 to a high of almost $250. Again, these are stabilized NOI per stall per month. This is all information which has been ascertained through the income and expense mailers, which we receive. So these would have been based on 2022, and we know that COVID was still happening in 2022. So some areas were affected, as you can see, quite severely, and others not so much. Hence, you have a pretty wide range there in the achievable NOI per stall. Page 5 of my brief shows the income value workup for this subject property. So in total, we have in our system 46 stalls, and we're applying a net monthly rate of $92 per stall. This rate is, from what I've seen, fairly standard for our downtown and exchange area parking lots. And then 4.5% capitalization rate is how you derive that $1,129,000 total assessed value. Page 6 of my brief shows the income value summary. So there's only one stream, one classification here for this property. So it's all laid before you right here, similarly as it was on page 5. Total net operating income configured at $50,784 by that capitalization rate of 4.5%. Page 7 of my brief has our standard modeled capitalization rate table here. Surface parking lots are not a property type which gets analyzed and released, in, to my knowledge at least, for Colliers, CBRE, Cushman Wakefield. So you're not going to see a category here for surface parking lots. And then beginning on page 9 of my brief, I've included the submitted income expense mailer by the property owner. So I have note here, the net operating income supplied for this reporting cycle is almost negative $9,600. And I'd also note that they have on this income and expense mailer 45 stalls, whereas we have 46 on file. I'm not sure what the discrepancy can be attributed to there. Generally, if we see that they have 46 on file, they've likely submitted that in the past, and that's probably where that number came from. But admittedly, I haven't been out there to count the stalls and double check. Page 10 of my brief shows that Impark is the manager or the leaser of this parking lot. And then beyond that, starting on page 11, I've included some photos and maps of the comparables which have been submitted. I don't find that there's one single best comparable here to use for the subject property. Of note, comparable number 2 is also non-contiguous, similar to the subject. You can see it's kind of two properties close by there on the corner of Bannatyne and Ship Street, but it is still quite a bit different. I think that's all the information I have to present on this property. So again, just to recap, 1,129,000 2025 modeled assessments using the income approach. And I'm open to any questions. Thank you very much.
Mr. Newman, any questions on the assessor's presentation, please?
Yes. First of all, good afternoon, Mr. Kupfer. How much do you know about how the model for parking lots is constructed? Let me be more specific. How much do you know? What do you know about how it works? What variables does it take into account? How does it arrive at the net operating income per stall?
I believe this will be based on inputs from our modeling team after reviewing the income and expense mailers, which would have been submitted between assessment cycles.
Okay, and I take it from that, it's fair to say that you're not part of that modeling, so you don't have familiarity, correct?
That's correct.
All right. Now, do you know over what period of time the data was collected? In other words, is it data going back to 2017, 18, 19? Is it data from 2020, 21, 22? What set of data is being utilized?
Yeah, I can't say specifically which set or which years would have been.
All right, and let me be clear to the panel, these questions are going to arise on all the properties. I'm not going to cover this in depth on all the properties. We're gonna cover it once in the interest of efficiency. All right, so the model, which is found at page 5 of your brief, says the net operating income per stall is $92. And as you've told us, you don't know how that's arrived at, but you do provide to us a set of comparables. So let's just look at those for a moment. On page 11, so that's 211 McDermott. And as we can see from the photos, 211 McDermott is surrounded by office buildings and indeed fronts onto Main Street, doesn't it?
Yes, sir. It's on the corner of Main and McDermott.
Right. And we can see in the photo, the lower half of that page, we can see the surrounding office buildings, correct?
Correct.
And then similarly, you're comparable to 124 Bannatyne. Again, we can see in the lower half of the photo on page 13, surrounded by office buildings, correct?
Office buildings, other parking lots, yes.
Okay. And then your third comparable, this is my favorite of all time, and actually this is on the docket. This is what I call the 4-stall comparable. To me, it looks like it's immediately adjacent to a building, and in fact, that's 200 Waterfront, correct?
Yes, sir, it is.
Okay. And then finally, we come to 125 Lombard, also on the docket today, and that's adjacent to buildings as well.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so let's come back to your photos of the subject. As you noted, page 2 and page 3, this is actually 4 separate parcels. And to some extent, they straddle the rail line, don't they?
Yes, between the rail line and the baseball diamond.
Well, but also on the west side of the rail line, correct?
Correct.
Right. And so these parking stalls are right up against the embankment, the concrete embankment, upon which the rail line sits, correct?
Correct.
And certainly from looking at these photos, these parking stalls, these lots, certainly are not surrounded by office buildings, are they?
I haven't looked up what these surrounding buildings are, but primarily it's other vacant lots and the baseball diamond.
Right. And you'd agree with me that the most significant demand generator for parking in downtown Winnipeg is office buildings?
Yes, I'd agree with that generally.
Okay. Now, you pointed us to your page 7, which is the capitalization rate page. And as you noted, there's nothing relating to parking lots. And I think you indicated that's because it's not reported by the brokers. But the city is, of course, free to report sales of parking lots if they choose, and to include that in their briefs. But there's nothing in your evidence about sales of parking lots and the capitalization rates which can be extracted. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And why does the city put nothing into its brief about cap rates on parking lots?
I suppose the simple answer would be nobody's done an analysis for us on that to provide for the hearings.
All right. So that's comforting to know that nobody's done an analysis. If I can take you back to page 1 of your brief, on the left-hand side, property description heading, there's a reference construction class, reinforced concrete frame. What is that a reference to?
I'm not sure what that's in reference to.
Okay. Is it possible it's the embankment upon which the rail line sits?
It's possible.
Okay. And in terms of the capitalization rate of 4.5%, which is shown on page 5 of your brief, everything on page 5 is model generated, correct?
Yes, sir.
And the rate, the net operating income per stall on page 5 of $92. Do you agree that that was the same rate that the city used for purposes of the 2023 assessment?
I believe it was.
All right, those are my questions. Thank you.
Ms. Linklater, do you have any questions for the assessor?
My questions have been asked and answered. Thank you.
Mr. Merritt, any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few questions. They're pertaining to.
You're a little bit quiet, Ron. Can you turn up your volume or something?
Sorry about that. Is that better?
A little bit.
Okay.
But try to speak up, I guess.
Okay. Mr. Kupfer, the existing property is used as a parking lot.
Yes, sir. I believe all 4 individual parcels are used for parking.
Yeah, and it consists of 46 parking stalls.
45 or 46. Yes, that's what we
Okay.
have. 46 on file. They reported 45 here.
Yeah. The highest and best use we're going to be talking about, because I've done some advanced reading in regards to what properties we have today. So in your estimate, the evaluation for the subject property is an income producing property, and it is the highest and best use of the property, correct?
Correct. In this instance, given the proximity to the rail line, the fact that it's 4 smaller non-contiguous pieces, I wouldn't assume a higher land value than the income value for this.
Mm-hmm. All right. And you have done the income approach, and you've used the model, which is produced the NOI and the cap rate of 4.5%, correct?
That's correct, sir.
Okay. All right. That's all the questions I have. Thank you, Mr. Kupfer.
Thank you. Could you speak a little bit more to the cap rate that has been proposed here at 4.5%, as to how the model came up with that amount? Can you give any kind of reasoning for that?
So in my experience here, our model will choose between 4.5% and 5% for cap rates for surface parking lots. Yes, they are lower than what you'll see in improved properties, whether it be office, industrial, or retail. And the general mentality behind that is that due to the lack of improvements, there's also generally a lower risk factor with these types of properties. If there's less that can go wrong, less that can break down, then there's less risk to the investor, hence the lower return on that investment.
Is there any data out there on other lots that have sold in the last few years that would give some information on what the cap rates would be for lands bought and sold? Well, parking lots sold. Or did you look for that information and wasn't available, or?
I wouldn't say we have a surplus of that information available. Of the few that I have reviewed in the past, they tend to line up pretty well with our model, generally between 4 and 5.5%.
And I'm just looking at the actuals, and even last year there was a deficit of almost was it $10,000, correct, on this property?
For 2022, yes.
Right. And did you take that into consideration when you were trying to evaluate this property? How it was performed?
No, there wasn't any site-specific override or anything like that. Our model has pushed out what it would see as a standard exchange or downtown parking lot rate. I would say both in terms of the NOI and in terms of the cap rate. I've seen $92 net per stall on quite a few of our income valued parking lots. And likewise with the 4.5% cap rate. So there doesn't seem to be any site-specific or override to what our model would suggest here.
Do you have any ideas as to what would have caused that? What I guess would be if you take into consideration what your model has presented, what that would it then be an anomaly, right? What would have caused that? To have such a deficit in 1 year?
I wasn't not fully aware of what was happening back, I guess, a little over 2 years ago. I believe the Goldeyes were playing, and I believe they were letting people into their stadium, provided they were vaccinated and had their little vaccine card chip. So I'm not sure how that may have impacted attendance at the stadium in terms of concerts and other events, that sort of thing, where you'd be looking to generate additional income. Again, I can't speak specifically if that number had dropped in 2022 or not. I would suggest that's probably likely. And likely part of the reason why the NOI is so poor for this reporting cycle.
You didn't provide any mailers for any other years, correct?
Nope, just the one for 2022.
Just for 22. And why is that? Why didn't you provide any other ones?
It's just pretty standard how we prepare for our border revision briefs. I always pull the same income and expense mailer. It's always 2022. Sometimes the NOI comes out high, sometimes it comes out low, and I stress that we rely on a larger sample size, or we try to rely on a larger sample size for our computer-assisted mass appraisal.
And your belief is that railway splitting these properties wouldn't cause any issues with revenue generation? Is that what I understand?
To my knowledge, the railway wouldn't impact its ability to generate revenue as a parking lot. Largely, you're looking at what's going on in the downtown in the surrounding area and how that might have impacted it, whether it be for short term or for long term. Yeah.
Okay, I have no further questions. Mr. Newman, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you. So, first of all, I have to confess that when I prepared my brief, I was operating under a mistaken assumption that the value of the property was determined on a land value basis. And so I spent a considerable period of time talking about some things, which in hindsight, I didn't have to talk about. Now, in part that was because we had a docket a week ago where we did have to talk about it a lot. And Mr. Kupfer and I talked a lot about highest and best use, and we will get to that a little bit in the context of 3 other properties on this docket. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip, well, I'm not gonna completely skip past it. I'll start at page 2 of my brief rather. So we know the property is 19,659 square feet. We know it's assessed at $1,129,000. And we know that that's driven by 45 or 46 stalls at a net rate of $92 per month per stall, capitalized at 4.5%. I know, because I've been around perhaps too long, some might say, but I've done these parking lots and other parking lots for a long time. And of course, I've heard in the past the concept that there's no improvements, therefore there's less risk. And that's why the capitalization rates are lower. But I will tell you, if we go back 10 years, they were 6%. And if we go back 6 years, they were 5%. And then they went to 4.5%. And throughout that time frame where the cap rates moved around, people on my side of the table would continuously say, where's the evidence of transactions to support those cap rates? And the answer always was, we don't have transactions. Well, the truth is, there are transactions. I don't say there's a lot, but there are some, and I'm going to show them to you. And when the assessor says to you, as he did in response to a question from the panel, my review of the transactions indicates that they're in the range of the model cap rates, I disagree with that respectfully. So, still on page 2, as we know, it's adjacent to the High Line. It straddles the High Line. But there's also a bit of a story here in the sense that on the east side of the High Line, if any of you go to Goldeye games, you'll know when you come to the main entrances, there's a plaza area there. There's entertainment on game nights there. Because the city mandated, as part of its lease, and I'm going to show this to you, that this land be acquired and incorporated into the development of the baseball stadium. And I make reference to that at the bottom of page 2 of my brief, and I will show you the actual documents. But if you then go to page 3, I talk about the fact that the lands on the east side of the High Line are utilized during the summer months, the baseball season, let's call it May 1 to September 30, in conjunction with the stadium. Entertainment, they congregate, they come through a tunnel. And we're going to see in one of the later lots, there's actually a tunnel that's associated with the property known as 41 Westbrook. A tunnel beneath the rail embankment that people use to access and get to the baseball stadium. So, you know, there's an interesting argument to be made that this parking lot, or certainly the east side of it, which is part of the plaza for the baseball stadium, should have no value whatsoever. Because it is part of the economic unit which makes up the baseball stadium, which in turn is separately assessed. That argument could perhaps be made. So let's then jump ahead to page 5. So at page 5, I reference the definition of value. We all know it, of course. What would the willing buyer pay to the willing seller in the open market? And as the assessor has indicated, this property is valued on the income approach. And so that becomes, therefore, the question becomes, what's a buyer going to pay? Burden of proof is on the assessor. Let's not lose sight of that. Highest and best use, we can skip by that for now. Let's go to the bottom of page 7. Parking demand. So when we did the 2023 cycle of assessment with a value date of April 1 of 2021, at that point in time, we had experienced COVID for approximately 12 months. We didn't know where it was going to go. The Goldeyes didn't play in 2020. They played a few games at the end of 21 because they were allowed to come back in August and start playing. They played out of a ballpark in the States for most of 21. And then, of course, they were able to play in 22. I'll say to you in a general sense that demand for parking across downtown Winnipeg is diminished. I'll make that general statement to you. I see it on the parking structures I do. I see it on the surface lots I do. The reality is you take people out of the office buildings, you take people out of these hearing rooms, parking goes down. People aren't here to use parking. And yes, the city wants people back downtown. Unions don't want to come back downtown if they can avoid it. I'm not here to speak about that issue, but the reality is the demand is down. When the demand is down, the law of supply and demand comes into play. Pricing starts to change, but most importantly, top line revenue changes. Now, I asked the assessor very deliberately, because again, I've been around a long time. Mr. Merritt, I know you'll remember Lindsay Wareham, the parking lot guru, and perhaps Ms. Linklater, you as well, Mr. Moretsky. I'm not sure if you do, but you know the spirited hearings we had revolving around parking lots and her expertise and her knowledge and the work she did. She would know what the model says about what data is taken into account. I don't, and this is critical. Where does $92 net come from? Is it data from 17, 18, and 19, 18, 19, and 20, or 21, 20, 21, and 22? Where's that data coming from? And I find it interesting, as the assessor has acknowledged, and I did the 23 cycle of appeals, of course, $92 was the rate used on the 23 cycle of appeals. And so with a value date of April 1 of 21, at best, that would be 2020 and maybe 19 and maybe 18. 2 years pre-COVID, in other words. Now, when we're going to April 1 of 23, potentially we're looking at 20, 21, and 22, 2 full years of COVID impacts, 22 diminishing, but of course working patterns have changed. So it's critical to know what the model has done to gather data and what data it's gathered, and we simply don't know. And if we don't know, it's a real problem for you to make an informed decision. Page 8 of my brief. And again, I'm telling you a lot of detail now. I'm not going to repeat it. Page 8 of my brief. Impact of COVID. We know it's had a significant impact. The Downtown Biz Report spoke to a number of issues and concerns, and primarily it revolved around the fact people weren't coming downtown anymore. Transit ridership was down. The Winnipeg Parking Authority had a 50% decrease on their on-street parking demand. So all of this has an impact. And of course, page 9, we get to remote work. People like to work remote. I get it. I'm not being critical, but it has an impact. A lot of these panels are remote. It has an impact on demand for parking. And regrettably, people avoid downtown because of safety concerns, because of homeless people. All of that by way of background. I won't repeat it. So now let's get to the actual data for the property. So page 10, what I do is I lay out 5 years of data. And I give you the questionnaires for those 5 years as part of my report. And you can see, even in 18 and 19, it was never getting to $50,000 of revenue, let alone $50,000 of net operating income. You can see the expenses. And what I found interesting, and you see it at the bottom of my page 10, how much of those expenses are property tax paid to the city? The city, and I don't say this in a pejorative way, the city in many ways is the partner of the parking lot operators, because they're making and receiving far more money than the parking lot operators are receiving at the end of the day. So there's the revenue for 5 years, there's the net operating income for 5 years. How do we stabilize this? What do we do with it? And this is something you'll hear from me on all the properties. I took what I call the high road. I took a top level amount in my opinion. And here I stabilized the net operating income at $10,000. Achieved once in 2019, not achieved in 2021 or 22. It's the number I've used because I'm taking the high road, as I'm saying, calling it, on this. Okay, let's turn to cap rates. We all know what cap rates are. We deal with them all the time, but it's good to be reminded of some things. The cap rate is influenced by the risk associated with the investment's income capacity, how much income can it earn, and how risky is the stability of that income, the investor expectation, and the required returns in other investment vehicles. What else is available? Borrowing. We know that borrowing costs went up. We know that at April 1 of 2023, the Bank of Canada interest rate had gone up by 425 basis points. There's the chart on my page 12. Why do I tell you that? Because I say to you simply, interest rates are the engine that drives the real estate economy. We don't use debt service. We don't take that into account in valuation. I get that. But you can be darn sure investors take it into account in making their investment decisions and determining what they will pay. And it's an integral part of how capitalization rates are arrived at. Page 14, office market cap rates. I give you information on office market cap rates, and you might say, why? The simple answer is because the office market is the driver of demand for downtown parking. There's no big shopping center downtown, there's no IKEA downtown, et cetera, It's the office market and the occasional. Sure, the Jets drive it on 45, 50 nights, days a year, but you can't make a living on 45 or 50 days. So the office market is what drives it. Office market cap rates have gone up. Why? Because vacancy has gone through the roof. Not just in Winnipeg, around the world. And when vacancy's up, it means there's fewer people downtown. So when office market cap rates go up, I say to you simply, so too do parking cap rates have to go up, because it tells you the stability of that income stream is diminished. Page 16, that's the city's cap rate chart. I'm comparing April 1 of 21 to 23. And what's interesting is if you look at the city's cap rate information, and I know we frequently disagree with this, but even if you look at the downtown A and B buildings, the cap rates have come up. In 2021, it's 6% on the A buildings. In 2023, it's 6.5 at the 20th and 80th percentile. On the B buildings, it's 6.75 in 21. It's 7% in 23. And the city's also increased the vacancy rates. So what I tell you then, as I come to the conclusion on cap rates at page 16, in 2018, the cap rate was 5. In 2020, the assessor moved to 4.5. They admitted readily at hearings they had no transactional evidence to support that. Boards frequently granted rates at 5. For 23, the assessor attempted, in many cases, to use a land value approach Generally, the board used an income approach and a cap rate of 5. Cap rates have to come up. Why? Because of COVID. Not just because of COVID, but because of the consequences of COVID. Incomes associated with the operation of parking lots are down significantly. There's less certainty in terms of what the future incomes for parking lots will be. Office workers have to a considerable extent deserted downtown Winnipeg, not returned. Assessors don't work in the office full time. Board of Revisions don't always participate in hearings by attendance. Through all of this, demand for parking is down, interest rates went up. Now, I then move to a concept of Altus analysis. And I want to jump you here to page 34 of my brief. Page 34 of my brief, and Altus has published a study on parking lots. And Mr. Navarro, who is the author of the study, has provided it to me and is well familiar with the fact that I'm presenting this at hearings. He has analyzed a variety of sales, and in cases where the sale reflected a continuing use as a parking lot, he has reflected a capitalization rate on those properties. And what you see is generally there's one at 4.65%, 170 Bannatyne. I'll speak a little bit more about that in a minute, but generally they're in the 5.38, 5.49, 6.04, 6.73, I missed 5.08. They are all higher, well higher than 4.5. And some of these transactions occurred at an earlier point in time before the full impacts of COVID were evident. The 4.65, 170 Bannatyne, there was a conversion of the adjacent office building at 433 Main Street. That was converted in part to residential. And the belief is that a premium was paid for that lot because it was needed to make parking available to the residents of that now multi-use, partially converted to residential building. So what I say back to my page 17 is that I'm going to use a cap rate of 5.5%. And when I apply that to my net operating income of $10,000, I get to a value of $181,000. And I will readily acknowledge that's very, very different than the assessment of $1,129,000. I understand that. This is very unique land up against the railway embankment. Practically, it has no other use. And I know when people go looking for parking, there's two things they look for first and foremost. How much is it going to cost? And how far away is it from where I have to be? How far am I going to have to walk in the cold winter? That's what runs through their head. These parking lots, located where they are a considerable distance, I'll suggest to you, from the demand generators, and therefore are always going to be lots that are least favored. So having said that, let me just flip you through a few pages and then I will be done. Go to page 24.
Sorry about that.
So recall I mentioned earlier that there's a tunnel that comes through underneath the embankment. That's the photo of the tunnel. That'll become more important in the context of 41 Westbrook, which we'll get to. But here you see the embankment. And this is how cars park up against the embankment. Then if you jump ahead And what you've got here is I've taken photos of each section. But I think you have the picture, pages 29, 30, 31, 32. Are questionnaires. Page 34 I've talked about, it's the Altus analysis. Page 35 through 47, 46. These are excerpts from the lease between Canadian National Railway and the numbered company that at that point took the lease. This is a 999-year lease between CN. And what it does is it leases these lands. It recognizes they're up against the railway embankment because it has some perhaps somewhat unusual provisions. You see on page 43 the site plan of what's covered by the lease, the parcels of land. And not all of these are part of this role, to be crystal clear. Some of them are part of other roles we'll deal with. Page 44 is the roadway reference, and this is recognition by the lessee that there are roadways through some of these lands that others need for access, because some of these parcels of land are landlocked, and this is the agreement to allow it. Page 45 is recognition of the fact that there's telecommunications licenses of various kind through some of these lands, and that's the obligation to allow it. Page 46 is the recognition that of special conditions. There's noise and vibrations and odors coming from the rail line. There's sparks coming from the locomotives. And this maybe becomes more important in the context of land value and future development opportunities. So certainly some of the conditions were recognized. And then at page 47, this is the lease between the City of Winnipeg and Riverside Park Management, which allowed for the construction of the baseball stadium. The reason it's important is if you look at page 51. You should see an arrow in the margin. And this is a recital of the obligation of the tenant to obtain from CNR an interest in CNR required lands, and these are the lands that make up these parking lots. Why? Because there was an obligation on the part of the tenant, on the part of Riverside, to incorporate these lands into the operation of the ballpark, and that's the plaza I spoke with earlier, which again, if you've attended Goldeye Games, you know you walk through it to get into the stadium. So that's why this lease is important. And if you look at page 58, at the bottom, you see the definition of project, and you'll see the reference to the fact that that the improvements and everything that's to be incorporated, and right at the bottom, there's a squiggly line, shall include a public plaza entry area, no more than 33 parking stalls. And again, that's why these lands are incorporated ultimately into the development of the stadium. So just a couple of comments about some comments the assessor made. Actually, I think I've covered it all. That's my submission. I appreciate I took some time, but I won't repeat.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cupfer, any questions for the applicant on the presentation?
Just a few. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm still looking at page 34 of your submission, Mr. Newman, the table, which I think you said was provided by Mr. Navarro at Altus.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could speak to some of the vacant entries here. I understand there are some comments associated with them. Beginning with 175 Donald. My understanding was that this property was used for parking prior to the sale and is now part of a land assemblage. The comment simply says it was not a commercial parking lot. See appendix. Can you speak to that?
So this is the site on the corner of Donald and St. Mary's, the southeast corner, where Gord Howard, who's the owner of the Keg franchises, was building a building upon which, or within which, a Keg would relocate on the main level, and up above it would be multiple floors of apartments. It ran into difficulty. It ended up in receivership. That's beside the point. The point that Mr. Navarro was making is this was part of a land assembly. It wasn't bought for continuing use as a parking lot. It was bought to be part of this development.
Okay, thank you. I have a similar question for 240 St. Mary underneath that. The comment says, not a commercial parking lot. Small overall, appears to serve as parking for adjacent commercial property.
Right.
What does Mr. Navarro mean by not a commercial parking lot?
So it's not a parking lot that's available for rent to the public for casual or monthly use. It's a parking lot. There's a nearby office building, and the owner of that office building acquired it because he had to provide parking to his tenants. So it's dedicated to the tenants.
Thank you. And just my last one on 360 Hargrave. I'm confused about this this comment as well. Again, my understanding was it's currently used as parking. This one states that this is a residential development lot in the downtown living sector, and then it states a bylaw.
So what this relates to is many, many, many years ago, the Young Men's Hebrew Association, the YMHA, on the corner of Hargrave and I think it's Quappel, to the north of Ellis. Shelter bought this site when the YMHA relocated to the Rady Center in Tuxedo, so it goes back a lot of years. They have tried to develop it continuously over the years and have not been successful, and tried to get variances to allow it to be used as parking, and the city actually turned that down. So that's the backstory on this property.
So to your knowledge, then 360 Hargrave is not being developed and not being used as parking? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. My only other question is relating to the information you'd submitted. I believe it's for your stabilized NOI. Just bear with me here. I'm grabbing the page number. Page 10. So obviously there's a big diminishment in the revenue through 2020, 2021, 2022. I was just curious if there's been a change in management of the property, or if InPark has been the one consistently reporting and managing this property.
So InPark has continuously reported. What happened though is in the midst of COVID, InPark stepped away. They essentially said, there's nothing here for us to manage, and they stepped away. So that's what happened. But InPark was continuously involved until they stepped away.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Newman. Those are all my questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Merritt, do you have any questions for the applicant?
I have none, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Ms. Linklater, any questions?
I also have no questions. Thank you.
outside of what the Goldies use these parking, are all four, yeah, I guess I'll start with this question. All four of these areas, are they all attached to the Goldies in some way?
Yes,
Okay. But they are used, of course, the Goldies only play whatever it is, 20 games, 30 games, I don't know what it is, but outside of that,
50 odd games, but 4 months more importantly.
right,
Yeah,
outside of those time periods, who generally uses those lots?
well, so my office is at Portage in Maine.
Right.
And in theory, I could park there. It would be way cheaper than parking where I do. But as I said to you, first question is, how far and how cold? I'm old, I like it underground and warm. It costs me more money, but I don't want to take a hike in the winter. And you know, that's just truth. But absolutely, people will look for cheaper. People will look for, and will be prepared to walk further. So this becomes, because of its distance, because of where it is, a lot of lesser choice. And lesser choice always brings lesser price and lesser demand.
Okay, so to your knowledge, these lots, outside of when there's a game, even during the day, when on a business day, pretty sparsely used then, on a daily basis?
There's an ebb and flow, obviously, and I think there was more of an ebb, a reduction in 20 and 21. You can see the revenue came up a bit in 22, without question. And it does always depend a little bit on what's going on in town. You know, is there lots happening in the Forks, for example, that might generate some more demand, things like that.
On page 10 there, your notation regarding, what's page 10? Something about, yeah, property taxes are significant expense, and you have some figures there. Are those concluded in the expenses you have above there?
They are.
So outside, they're a significant portion of those expenses.
They are.
34.
And can I just observe, if you were interested in buying a parking lot, are you gonna buy a parking lot knowing that the city taxes are gonna give you more, or are gonna give more to the city than you're ever gonna get in your pocket? The person who used to manage Impark for years and years in Winnipeg, a fellow named Richard Wisnowski, told me that Impark never bought a surface parking lot in Winnipeg. Why? Because the vendors of these properties always thought they were worth a lot of money because they had future development opportunity. And we'll come to talk more about this when we get to those land value lots. And from Impark's perspective, they're in the parking lot business. They need to make a yield on their investment. It never worked. So they never bought a surface lot in Winnipeg. They would buy parking structures because that's going to trade more readily on an income basis because that's all it can be used for. But the owners of surface lots frequently had stars in their eyes in terms of worth, and they never bought one. Telling in my mind.
Next, one more question on page 34 with the cap study that Mr. Navarro did there. Those are all parking lots, yeah?
Yes.
In Winnipeg?
Yes.
Okay, that's the only question I had. Hey, anything in summation, Mr. Cupper?
None for me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anything in summation?
I'm good, thank you.
That then will conclude item number 1, Pioneer Avenue, file 243230. Are we okay to proceed? Anybody need a break or anything? We're okay to go? Okay. We will then proceed to item number 2. Also a property on Pioneer Avenue, file 24-3226. This is an application for revision of assessed value. Mr. Cupper, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That file number pertains to roll number 1209-199-6100. Again, the street address is Pioneer Avenue. This property is also owned by the Canadian National Railway Company. This is just one parcel this time, no separate non-contiguous pieces. The land area is 3,747 square feet. It's a surface parking lot, and we have a 2025 model-driven assessment using the income approach again of $221,000. I'm going to recommend be confirmed today. Again, we have no recent sales on the subject property to base our valuation off of, so we're using comparables. Pages 2 and 3 show some photos of the subject property, quite similar to the last one we discussed. This one also appears to abut onto the rail line and is in close proximity to the baseball diamond. Page 4 of my brief, I've submitted all the same comparables for your review, no changes there, with a range from a little over $40 a foot, $40 just per stall, to that high one up at $248 per stall. We're modeling the subject property using the same parameters as the last one we discussed here. Like I said, $92 net per stall and a 4.5% capitalization rate. And this one has 9 stalls, which derives that NOI of just under $10,000, capitalized at 4.5% to $221,000 total. And that's reiterated again on my page 6 for the income value summary. Pages 7 and 8 are the same capitalization rate table we include for our for all of our briefs, as well as the Municipal Assessment Act excerpts. And then beginning on pages page 9 to page 10, the income and expense information is provided by the property owner. So they list 9 stalls, that's what we have on file, and net operating income of just under $4,000 for this reporting period, 2022. And again, the property manager is in park, same as the last one we discussed. And then beginning on my page 11 and through the rest of my brief are simply photos and maps of those same 6 parking rent comparables that I've provided and we've already discussed. So with that, I don't think I have anything else to add on this particular subject property. Again, 2025 model-driven income assessment of $221,000. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Newman, any questions for the assessor?
Mr. Kupfer, if I asked you all the same questions I asked you in the last hearing, would your answers be any different?
No, they should be the exact same.
All right, so I won't ask them. But just look at your page 2. So at the left edge of the photo, that's Main Street, correct?
Left edge of the photo. That would be Westbrook Street. We're looking at the same photo.
Yes, I think you're right. Okay. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Mr. Merritt, any questions?
I have none, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Ms. Linklater, any questions?
Just for clarification, Mr. Kupfer, your brief was all model driven?
That's correct. No changes or alterations from what was produced by the model to my knowledge.
Okay. Did you prepare this brief?
I did, yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you. That's all my questions, Mr. Chair.
And, I have no questions. Mr. Newman, you begin your presentation for the property.
So again, I'm not going to repeat. Let's go to page 9. You can see the income. So this lot, I guess, is a bit of an island almost between Pioneer on the one side and William Stevenson Way on the other. As the assessor has noted, it's right up against the embankment. It's got 9 stalls. You can see that if you look at page 9, the revenue has actually held up somewhat better. I can only say that in relative terms, compared to some of the other lots, It is closer to Main Street. And at Main and Pioneer and William Stevenson Way, there's a concentration of office buildings. So it is a little bit closer. You can see that, again, the revenues have stayed relatively consistent, a downward trend a bit in 2022. Expenses have also stayed relatively consistent. I ultimately picked a net operating income of $7,000. And again, as I said to you, I'm trying to take a higher road, being quite reasonable in terms of the selection of the net operating income. Arguably, it could have been $8,000. I don't think it much matters in terms of the ultimate value. The cap rates, I would make the same presentation to you that I made before. And so if you jump ahead to page 16, you'll see that I've selected a capitalization rate of 5.5%, driven in part by the Altus analysis, driven in part by the fact that I just think the stability of parking lot income is riskier than it was previously, so rates have to come up, and that turns into a value of $127,272. And really, I think that's all I have to say to you on this one.
Mr. Kupfer, any questions for the applicant?
Just a couple brief ones. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking at your page 9, Mr. Newman, the income performance for the property. And I'm scratching my head a little bit. We've obviously talked about COVID and potential reduction in demand for parking. But in this case, it appears both 2020 and 2021 had reasonable demand, and then that dropped off all of a sudden for 2022 specifically. Can you speak to the reduction in revenue at all for the subject property just for this 1 year?
I don't know why that 1 year dropped off a bit. Again, there's sometimes an ebb and flow, and it was just down.
Okay. And have you done an analysis of any comparable lots, or is your valuations, the ones you'll be presenting today, primarily based off of stabilization of the site-specific income?
Stabilization of site-specific.
Okay, those are my questions. Thank you.
Ms. Linklater, any questions for the applicant?
Sorry. No, I have no questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Merritt, any questions?
I have none, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
I have none. Therefore, excuse me, Mr. Kupfer, anything in summation?
No summation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Newman, anything in summation?
No, thank you.
Okay, therefore, that then concludes item number 2, file number 24-3226, Pioneer Avenue. We will then carry on to item number 3, 110 Pioneer. This is an application for revision of the assessed value. Mr. Kupfer, you can begin your presentation, please.
Thank you. As you said, file number 24-3107. The roll number is 1209763930, and the street address is 110 Pioneer Avenue. This lot is owned by the city of Winnipeg. It is in use as a surface parking lot with a land area of 25,016 square feet. And a 2025 modeled assessment, this time using land of $2,910,000, which I'm going to recommend be confirmed today. Scrolling down to page 2 of my brief, you'll see that this property is right next to the last one we had discussed. You can see it on the cutout here. So it's located, again, quite close to the Ball Diamond, in between Pioneer and Water. And again, no recent sales for this subject property for us to help our valuation. Page 4 of my brief, you'll see some different comparables. These are land sale comparables. In fact, I think every single one of these is actually on Mr. Newman's list as well, in terms of our Altus's list, Mr. Navarro's list, the one that's been included in Mr. Newman's brief. As you can see, we have sale price per square foot ranging from a low of around $95 to a high of around $150, and quite a variation in size. Some properties lower, down to about 2,650 square feet, whereas our larger ones are up over 12,000. Subject property is larger than all of these. It's quite uncommon to find a property that large still vacant in downtown. So that's what we're dealing with here with the subject property. Below that is the classification and liability allocation. No issues here. The entire property has one classification. It's 60. So that's being run through our model at $116.33 per foot over that total area of 25,016 square feet is how we have our value of $2,910,000. Pages 5 and 6 pertain to capitalization rates. This property or this valuation doesn't include a capitalization rate as we're using land value. So I'm going to skip over that to the income and expense information submitted by the property owner and or IMPARC. For this property, reporting net operating income of around $25,000 for the reporting period and 47 stalls. Scrolling beyond that, starting on page 9, I've included some photos and maps of the comparable properties that I've selected. There are 6 for you to 6 for your reference, so you can get an idea of the location, the layout, the shape of the lot, that sort of thing. Beyond that, I don't have anything else for this property. So again, in conclusion, 2025 modeled land assessments of a little over $115 a foot, and gives $116 a foot, giving us our value of $2,910,000. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Newman, any questions for the assessor?
I do have some. So Mr. Kupfer, when we were last together about a week ago, I asked you to remind me how long you'd been with the department, and I believe you told me since 2016.
Yes, sir.
And I asked you about your educational background, and I asked you if you were familiar with the concept of highest and best use, and you indicated you were.
Yes.
And I believe I asked you then, and I ask you again now, did you conduct a highest and best use analysis in determining how you would value this property?
I haven't, no.
And you agree with me that this property has been used as a parking lot for a very long time? I'll suggest decades, but for a long time in any event?
Yes, I accept that.
Did you investigate this property and whether there are any limitations on how it can be developed in coming to your land value?
Beyond the zoning, no, I haven't.
And so is it fair to say that, and whether a use is legally permissible is part of highest and best use analysis, but beyond looking at the zoning, you didn't look otherwise at whether there's anything that might limit or restrict the scope of development on this property, correct?
Correct.
The comparables that you list on page 4 of your brief, would you agree with me that none of them are in any close proximity to the High Line, to the railway line?
Yes, I'd agree with that.
Those are my questions. Thank you.
Ms. Linklater, any questions for the assessor?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one question. Mr. Kupfer, who decided that this property would be valued for land? Was that you? Is there a specific requirements by the city in regards to size that they?
Sorry, please finish.
No, I'm done.
Okay. No requirement for size. To my knowledge, the main precursors that might eliminate it from being used as land would be zoning. If there was some sort of restriction that we were aware of, granted our computer-assisted mass appraisal model doesn't do a great job of tracking and applying those things, but the largest determining factor is simply the value that is produced. So if the income stream value in our mass appraisal model comes out with, say, 2.5 million, and the land value comes out at 2.9 million, it is the value which is deemed higher or maximally productive, going back to the highest and best use argument, which will be certified by our model. There isn't anything much further to it than that.
Okay. So you didn't take into consideration the location?
No, the location specifically not a factor in our mass appraisal modeled analysis here.
Okay, and this was entirely model driven?
It was, yes, $116.33. That's from the model.
All right, I thank you. That's all my questions.
Mr. Merritt, any questions for the assessor?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Kupfer, at times when evaluating property, you deal with consistency. So why wouldn't you consistently, if you're doing surface parking lots on an income approach, be consistent and do the same thing here? I know you gave me an answer, determining the highest value. Well, that's not being consistent.
Well, you're
So
not wrong. Yeah, you're not wrong. That a lack of consistency can make it seem perhaps less equitable. Certainly more confusing for the property owners. To my knowledge, this is the way we've assessed property for quite some time. It's become more of a prevalent issue, I would say, over the last few years due to COVID, as many of those income streams tended to fall off. Many of them were surpassed by the base land value assigned by our system. So that could be why you're seeing it more often or in a less consistent way.
Fair answer. It's just a little confusing, that's all. I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. And I thank you.
Okay, thank you. So if I look on page 3 there, this kind of trapezoidal shape for the land. How many cars does it, how many stalls does it currently have? It's used as a parking lot. Yeah.
We have on file 47.
47?
Yes.
Okay. But somebody can build a structure on this, correct?
To my knowledge, yes. I'd also point out the income and expense mailer also states 47, so that appears to be the correct stall count.
So, to your knowledge, somebody can build a structure on this, or is it zoned for that? this land?
Well, the zoning is C character, which does allow for mixed use and commercial development. Yes, that's as far as our mass appraisal model would go in determining that.
So it is your opinion then, or assertion from your presentation that somebody would buy this property for building something on it then, rather than as a parking lot?
Potentially, they could potentially buy it and keep it as a parking lot as well. Of my comparable land sales here, of the 6, only 2 of them have been developed since that date of sale. 4 of them remain in that interim use as surface parking. So it's not that all of these were sold and immediately developed or anything like that.
But you did state to Mr. Merritt that in your analysis that you determined that land value was a higher, better use of the property.
Yes, our model will develop two values for these. It actually produces a land value for all the 200,000 plus properties in our system, but it'll also produce an income stream, an income value. And if the land value is higher than the income value, then it's that land value which will be certified and set for the assessment.
I guess I'll just re-ask the question again. Then according to your analysis, then if somebody would buy this property for $2.910 million, it's quite likely they want to build something on it then.
That could be possible, yes.
Okay.
They could also just
Don't belabor it. Okay. Mr. Newman, you may begin your presentation.
I'll start where the assessor finished his last answers to questions. Because I appreciate the assessor's candor. Because I think what he's telling you ultimately is that the model doesn't really take into account locational adjustments, and it doesn't take into account whether somebody would actually build on the land. And that's why when you ask the question, is it saying somebody would develop? He said potentially. So I think that's important because, and that brings us back to the test of highest and best use. So let's go to my brief. Page 2. And you can see from the photos, and Mr. Moretsky, you used the term trapezoidal shape.
That's correct or not,
but it's irregular.
Yeah,
It's not rectangular, it's not square. And that frequently creates issues in terms of utility and efficiency of the property. And as I say at page 2 on my brief, because I've looked at the measurements, the property at the east end is 12.7 meters wide. And at the west end, it's 32.839 meters wide. But at the west end, and remember that the last property we did, the 9-stall lot, is really part of this lot. To the naked eye, it's a single parking lot. And that 9-stall lot is right up against the high line. And what that means is practically is at least a portion of this lot is within 30 meters of the rail line. Why is that important? Because if you look at page 2 of my brief, the city of Winnipeg adopted standards with respect to development in proximity to railway operations. And that all came out of the Lac-Mégantic disaster and what happened there. And this was adopted across Canada through the efforts of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. And essentially, you can't develop within 30 meters of a railway main line. And so I'm going to show you some measurements in due course, but what it means is that there are portions of this property that you can't develop upon because of that. Now, I'll come back to that. Page 3, burden of proof on the assessor, as I've said, highest and best use. We've touched upon this a little bit. I'll take another minute to walk through this. Page 4, the International Association of Assessing Officers, July 2017, Standards on Mass Appraisal, talks about the fact that you've got to determine highest and best use by analyzing 4 components: legally permissible, physically possible, appropriately supported, and financially feasible, thereby resulting in the highest value. That's not what's been done here. What the system has done is it's calculated 2 values, one income-based, one land value-based. It defaults to the higher. It does no analysis about highest and best use. It does no analysis in terms of land value based on the location of the land, proximity to the rail line, or anything else. It does none of that. It simply defaults to the highest value. So we know, and I didn't belabor this with the assessor because he and I have been through this a week ago, you need to do highest and best use. You need to look at, is it physically possible? Is it legally permissible? So yes, legally permissible simply means the zoning bylaw will permit a multitude of uses. Okay, wonderful. Is it physically possible? That's a whole different question. What can you actually build on this site, considering the shape, considering the required 30-meter setback from the rail line? How much can you actually build on this site? Because if you can't build very much, maybe you're not going to pay $116 a square foot. Maybe you're not going to pay what others paid for regularly shaped properties, not in proximity to the rail line. And finally, at page 5, and we know these 4 criteria weren't even addressed, but you've also got to show that the proposed alternate use is reasonably probable. So we've got a parking lot use for decades in an irregularly shaped property on an island between William Stevenson Way and Pioneer. Does somebody want this land? Or would they rather buy all sorts of other parcels that don't bring these idiosyncratic characteristics with them? I think that's a rhetorical question. I think you know what my answer to that would be. So now I turn to the income approach. We're back to COVID. We're back to people not being downtown. We're back to remote work. We're back to all of that. And now let's go to page 8. And there's the history of the performance of the property. And again, this one held up reasonably, but fell off in 2022. And I don't know why, but it did. And again, being pretty conservative from my perspective, I pick a net operating income of $40,000. And that's what I pick. Again, I make the observation, top of page 9, look at the tax load on this property. It's huge. Capitalization rates, I think you've heard me lots on that already. Again, the key issue here, I think, is the stability of the parking stream of income. If you go to my page 14 and 15, that's where I talk about the same reasons again, COVID and office workers disappearing and interest rates going up, the Altus analysis, all of that leads me to 5.5%. Remember, of course, office cap rates are up as well. Vacancy has increased, and that's why there's less people in these parking lots. And so ultimately, I come to a value at page 15 of $7,727,000. I will observe to you that I believe 2023 was done on the income approach at a value of $1,153,000. And I didn't do it, but that's my understanding. And so to go to 2,000,009 is undoubtedly a shock to somebody's system. Looking then at some of the pages that follow in my brief, go to page 17. You see the again, somewhat irregular shape. You see Pioneer and William Stevenson Way, bracketing this property, I'll use the word. You see the overhead view on page 18. And again, as I noted to you earlier, the 9-stall lot we did earlier is really part and parcel of this lot. It's actually landlocked. You can't get to the 9-stall lot, but by going through this lot. There are the dimensions on page 19. That's the westernmost edge of the lot at 32.839 meters. And there is on page 20. So again, this is the western edge of the subject property, but it's also the 9-stall lot to the immediate west of it. And what I really want you to take away from this is the distance, the boundary, the size of that westernmost lot, the 9-stall lot. And on the northern boundary, it's 14.484 meters. And on the southern boundary, it seems to be 5.95 meters. The point I'm making to you simply is the portions of the subject property are going to be well within the 30-meter requirement in terms of construction. And again, even once you get beyond the 30-meter requirement, and in theory, you're free to build without that restriction, you really want to build here in proximity to the rail line. The rest of the documents that follow are the questionnaires. It's the lease excerpts with Canadian National Railway. It's all of that same material I've taken you before. So subject to questions, that would be my submission.
Thank you. Mr. Kupfer, any questions for the applicant?
Just one or two. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Newman, you made mention a few times about the shape of the property, but how it isn't, of course, a perfect rectangle or square like you would ideally want. Am I correct in saying there's no photos or maps for any of your comparable properties?
Or not.
Okay. Can you speak to the configuration or the shape of any of these comparables on page 28?
Well, actually, a number of them were your comparables as well. So 175 Donald, 240 St. Mary, 170 Bannatyne. So a number of these are your comparables as well, and they are reflected in your brief. And so as I look at them, I'm at page 9 of your brief for 126 King, rectangular, 175 Donald, rectangular, 240 St. Mary, very close to square, but maybe a little bit more rectangular, but very close to square. That's the lot behind Mitzi's, the former Mitzi's Chicken Fingers. 633 McDermott, rectangular, and one block to the east of Sherbrooke. 170 Bannatyne, a little bit more irregularly shaped. I'll acknowledge that. One block east of Maine on Bannatyne, and then 127 Bannatyne, very, very close to being rectangular. So I think a lot of them were far more regular in their shape than the subject is.
Okay, thank you. That's my only question.
Mr. Merritt, any questions for the applicant?
I have none, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Ms. Linklater, any questions?
Yes, just one question to Mr. Newman. How long, to the best of your knowledge, has this been a parking lot? I think you had brought that up in your, you were discussing your brief.
Yes, so as part of the construction of the baseball park, there was a reconfiguration of William Stevenson Way and Pioneer to some extent, and that created the roadways as they are now. That goes back 15 to 20 years. I believe it was a parking lot before that, but the configuration may have been slightly different. But certainly for 15 to 20 years, It's been in its present configuration ever since they redid the roadways there.
All right, I thank you. That's all my questions, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Does anybody who owns the land right now? Sorry, is it the city?
The city, when it's leased, and again, it's ultimately part of the ballpark arrangement.
Mhm.
It's leased by the city to the Goldeyes, to Riverside, to allowed for the development.
And how long has that been? Ever since the Goldeyes have been there?
Yes.
So quite a long, decades even, right?
Well, the baseball stadium opened for the Pan Am Games in 1999.
Right. So it's never been listed, this
No.
property, never been listed, okay. I do not have any further questions then. That will then bring to a conclusion, this matter, property item number 3, 110 Pioneer. And I think it's a good time to go into a break recess. So we'll go 10 minutes, return please in 10 minutes from now. Okay. We are back in order. Our next property is item 4, file 3234 on Westbrook Street. This is an application for revision of assessed value. Mr. Kupfer, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The roll number for this property is 1306-0805-000. The street address is simply Westbrook Street, and the owner is the Canadian National Railway Company. This is again a surface parking lot with a land area of just over 10,000 square feet. The M multiple use zoning code and 2025 modeled assessment using the income approach of $540,000, which I'm going to recommend be confirmed today. Pages 2 and 3 of my brief show photos and maps of the subject property. As you can see, this property also abuts the rail line. It's owned by CNR and managed by Impark, like many of the properties we've discussed today. We have 22 stalls on file here, and that's confirmed by the INE. Page 4 of my brief shows the same rent comparables, parking rent comparables, kind of scattered out throughout downtown, with the same highs and lows. I won't reiterate that. Page 5 of my brief shows the income value workup. So again, 22 stalls, that same rate being applied, $92 a stall, and 4.5% capitalization rate is how we derive the $540,000 assessment. Page 6 of my brief contains the income value summary. Again, all one classification, all one stream, so this part is straightforward. Pages 7 and 8 include the capitalization rate table and the municipal act excerpts that we've covered. And then pages 9 and 10 include the income and expense mailer submitted by the property owner / property manager. Note, I can confirm the 22 parking stalls, and then for 2022, negative net operating income of around $1,500 for the subject property. And then beginning on page 11, I've included the same photos and maps for my comparables for your reference. Again, I don't think I have one best comparable or one apple-to-apple comparison here, so I'll leave that with you to make your determinations. But again, in summary, we're looking at a 2025 assessed value of $540,000 using income. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Newman, any questions for the assessor?
So the valuation on page 5 again is all model driven.
Yes, sir.
Those are my questions. Thank you.
Mr. Merritt, any questions for the assessor?
I just have one. Mr. Kupfer, normally these surface parking lots are unserviced, are they not? I just note that there's a notation that it's unserviced land.
Generally speaking, yes. At best, you might get some parking plugins, but I don't believe that's the case with this one.
No. Okay. I thank you. That's it. Thank you.
Ms. Linklater, any questions?
I have no questions. Thank you.
So you have determined that the income approach is the highest and best use for this lot?
Yes, sir.
Is this property straddling split by the railway there? Is that, I'm looking on page 3, is that the property I see there, or is it?
Yes, sir. It's the square property, so it appears to be on both sides of the railway here.
And you have 22 stalls. So all you can do basically is park against the embankment, and that's what it looks like on both sides.
I believe so.
Further questions? Mr. Newman, your presentation, please.
Thank you. Just a question Mr. Merritt asked, I'll start there. He asked if it was serviced, suggesting frequently it's not serviced, and you made reference to potentially electric plug-ins. Perhaps he had in mind things like sewer and water, which to me is the more traditional type of servicing that assists in valuing land. I don't think this land is serviced. It doesn't front onto a street, but I'll leave that there. And Mr. Merritt, if you have more concerns, you can ask me about it. So at the end of the day, the story is much the same. The assessor here is using an income approach. It's model driven. It's the same $92. That I don't want to belabor this, but I don't want us to lose sight of it either. It's the same $92 net per stall that we don't have any information on in terms of how that data is derived, from what number of years it's derived, from which years it's derived. Are they COVID impacted years preceding COVID? We don't know that. $92 was also the rate for the 2023 cycle. So we come back, now I'm on to page 7 of my report, and we can see here that, again, I'm talking about remote work, I'm talking about downtown safety issues. I'm on to page 8. Again, you can see 5 years of history in terms of revenue generation, and you can see it falling off. You can see the net operating income falling off at the bottom of page 8. Again, you can see that the size of the tax bill on this property over the years. And again, taking from my perspective, what I think is quite a conservative view, I set the net operating income at $15,000. Clearly, it hasn't been anywhere near that in 2021 or 22. But again, I've been quite conservative. Indeed, some might even say overly generous. Some might criticize me, but that's what I've done. And if we now jump ahead to page 15, we come to the capitalization rate again of 5.5%, derived in the same way. And using the $15,000 net operating income, that brings the value down to $272,727. I'll make one other observation to you, which is this. When you have high rent, in theory, that's riskier. The sustainability of high rent for anything, in theory, it might be riskier than lower rents. And so sometimes with high rent comes a higher capitalization rate to take into account risk. That's another reason why I think you should quite easily and readily go to the 5.5% capitalization rate. So again, I would stop there, and I'm open for questions.
Mr. Kupfer, any questions for the applicant?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one question about, I'm looking at your page 8, Mr. Newman, and I apologize, it seems similar to another question I've asked you, but I would have expected the revenues to drop off here more significantly for 2020 and 2021, and then start to recover more so for 2022 with what I know and what you've stated about the Goldeye Stadium and return to work, that sort of thing. Can you comment on why 2022 is such a lower revenue stream than every other year?
Yeah, and I can't give you an answer. All I can do is contemplate possibilities that and again, I'm doing a lot of parking lots, I'm doing a lot of parking structures, and so I'm seeing generally the fall off in revenues. Obviously, there's a big dip between 18-19, where it's pretty consistent around 48,000. Then it trends down substantially in 20, even more 21, and even more in 22. So I can't answer the question for you specifically, but as I say, I think I've recognized some variability by taking into account and arriving at a $15,000 net operating income.
Okay, thank you, sir. Those are all my questions.
Ms. Linklater, any questions?
I have no questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Merritt, any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Newman, you're absolutely correct when I'm talking about unserviced lots. As I go through all these briefs, I make all kinds of notes. So the unserviced lots pertain to sewer and water. Yes, I agree.
And I contemplated that as well, of course, because I was, as I said at the outset, I mistakenly believed all of these were being done land value. And so I was conscious of that in the context of land value. And so I put in the excerpt from the city's website, which talks about whether it has a frontage levy for sewer and water, indicating that they're not serviced. I did that on a number of them. And then, as I say, I realized that, in fact, a lot of them were being done income value, and so that became less relevant.
All right. I thank you, Mr. Newman. I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. I have no questions. Therefore, that brings to a close this property, item 4, file 3234 Westbrook Street. We'll then move to item number 5, 41 Westbrook. This is an application for revision of the assessed value. Mr. Kupfer, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's file number 24-3108, roll number 1209-3800500. The street address is 41 Westbrook Street, and the owner is the city of Winnipeg. So this is again a commercial surface parking lot. It's quite a large one. This one is 37,221 square feet. It has the M multi-use zoning, and this one has a 2025 model-driven assessment using land of $2,951,000. Pages 2 and 3 of my brief, again, are showing maps and photos of the subject property. So you can see this one is right next to the one we previously discussed. It fronts onto Westbrook Street. It's a relative good shape here, being rectangular with a bit of a jut out there, it looks like. Page 4 of my brief, I've included all the same land sale comparables that I'd submitted previously, no changes or omissions there. So the breakdown here, under the land valuation, like I said, 37,221 square feet. Over net rate, just under $80 a square foot is how we arrive at $2,951,000. And again, all one classification, no split or change there of the income or of the land. Beyond that, I'll take you down to pages 7 and 8. This is the income and expenses that were submitted for the subject property. Looks like a negative net operating income was accounted for 2022, similar to a few of the lots that we've seen today. And it appears they're reporting 96 stalls. And beyond that, starting on my page 9, are photos and maps of the subject property. I do have a few larger lots, which I'd recommend using as reference. Those would be the ones at those would be the lots at primarily comparables 5 and 6 on Bannatyne are probably the closest in terms of both proximity and land size. And they're both up around $95 a foot. Again, we're valuing this at a little under 80. I think that's all the information I have on this one. So again, 2025 modeled assessment using land, $2,951,000. Thank you.
Mr. Newman, any questions for the assessor?
Did you, in looking at the value of this land, do any investigations as to whether it is contaminated?
I have no knowledge of contamination on the site.
Looking at page 2 of your brief, you talked about the property being rectangular with a jut out. That jut out, recall we looked at a photo with a tunnel underneath the embankment. That's what that jut out is, correct?
I'll take your word for it, yes.
Okay. Did you, still looking at page 2, did you give any consideration to what portion of the land area is within 30 meters of the railway embankment?
I haven't, no.
And again, these are page 4. These are the same comparables that you've used on the other properties. And none of them in terms of location are anywhere near the High Line, correct?
Correct.
And again, this property has been used as a parking lot, I'll suggest to you, for decades. Any disagreement?
No disagreement.
Those are my questions. Thank you.
Ms. Linklater, any questions for the assessor?
Yes. Just sort of following up on Mr. Newman's question. Page 1 of your brief, this has been a parking lot since 1951, correct?
I'll have to double check how those year builts get inputted for our surface parking lots. I can't say 100% if that's correct or not.
Okay.
It's a fair assumption to make.
But this is on your brief. So
It is, yes.
That's what I'm going by. So 73 years it's been a parking lot, correct? So
potentially, yes.
So I'm just going to suggest, is this not a little speculative of the city to say that something can be built on it? Because nothing's ever been built on it.
Well, we aren't specifically saying that something will be built on it. I think, like I said in one of my previous answers, of my land sale comparables here, 4 out of 6 of them remain in use today as surface parking lots still. So because they're being evaluated on land doesn't mean that there's imminent development for the comparables.
Okay. Thank you.
I do not have any questions that haven't been asked already. Mr. Newman, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you. Page 2 of my brief.
Excuse me for 1 second. Excuse me for 1 second.
Oh, sorry, did I miss you?
That's okay. But
Sorry.
I do have a couple questions. Mr.
Sure.
Cuffer, I, scanned through, both parties' presentations. You have no knowledge that the site might be contaminated, or Mr. Newman can probably, in his presentation, address it is on the list of contaminated sites, but you have no knowledge of that.
No knowledge. No, I haven't researched any contamination for our docket today.
Okay. So, but the city of Winnipeg own this property. Is there a lease involved for the Gold Eyes? I would assume.
Yeah, so the INE that was submitted here lists Riverside Park Management as the operator.
Mm-hmm. So, just to follow up, and I'm not sure how this is broken up, but they talk about 50 stalls are allocated, I guess, for seasonal Gold Eye games. And then the balance for the year is 46 stalls for the general public. So, but is that correct? Do you know offhand?
I don't know if that's correct. Which page are you looking at, Mr. Merritt?
I can't recall. Okay, so it's just part of my notes. It's okay. We'll address that with Mr. Newman, but also it talked about the Westbrook Auto Service. Is there an auto service there on the property?
I don't see one.
Okay, it just it says occupied by Westbrook Auto Service.
Hey,
Nope.
that must be something from Mr. Newman's.
All right, okay. You have no knowledge of that. Okay, that's fine, Mr. Cupford. Thank you very kindly. Thank you.
Okay, again, I apologize for that. Now I have no further questions. Mr. Newman, you may begin your presentation.
So on the issue of contamination, at the bottom of page 2 of my brief, that little, I'll call it a flag, that's a screenshot of the Manitoba Conservation website identifying this site. And what it's telling us is that at one time, a long time ago, I think, Westbrook Auto Service operated from that location. Obviously, it's not been there in decades and decades, but because of that, it's noted and listed on the contaminated sites list as having been occupied by this entity, which, and historically, of course, service stations created contamination. So that's why it's there. So again, a couple of things here. The contamination issue, proximity to the main rail line, the 30-meter restriction in terms of where you can build. And I'll look at some mapping in a moment to further develop that. There's also some additional unusable land in the form of what I'll call the tunnel area. Obviously, there's nothing that can be built underneath the rail line, and so I would suggest that area of land, and I tried to scale it, and again, I'll show you some mapping, but I tried to scale it, and I got to about 1,506 square feet, which based on the assessor's value would come to about $119,000. At the end of the day, we're back to the concept of highest and best use. And even though, again, the majority of the properties on the docket today are done income, this one was done land. And again, because the system values it both ways, and it will kick out a higher value for the land. But that brings us back to highest and best use. Is there somebody who wants this land to develop it for this purpose? And I'm gonna suggest there's all sorts of parcels of land that don't have the proximity, don't have the impairment of proximity to the High Line and all that that means. And so if people really want to build something, there's a lot of other places to build things in downtown Winnipeg where God knows there's enough surface parking lots. So that brings us back to page 8, remote work, people not downtown. To page 9, again, there's the 5 years worth of revenue. And again, there's a steady decline. Again, I make the observation about the size of the tax component of the expenses. And to be clear, the only reason I made this observation is because frankly, when I looked at the questionnaires, I was a little bit surprised at how big the tax bill is, but be that as it may. The other thing that, and again, this shows up on some questionnaires and not on others, a business tax bill. So there's a business tax bill as well, potentially to be taken into account. And again, I was quite conservative, quite generous in my selection of the net operating income. I selected $70,000, which is higher than the net operating income in any year. And that's what I put it at. We then get to the capitalization rate discussion. And again, everything you've heard from me before, that takes me to page 16. And at page 16, what I'm doing is I'm reflecting a $70,000 net operating income capitalized at 5.5% to give you a value of $1,272,727, which is the value I'm asking you to use. If you look at page 18, so there's off the assessor's website. That's the property. And again, you can see, call it the handle, call it the jut out. That's the tunnel area that we saw in one of the other photos. If you go to page 19, and this is a little bit rough, I'll acknowledge, but there's a concept to be gleaned and gathered from all this. If you look at the mapping, if you look towards the top of the property, but not to the top of the photo, you can see a laneway running east-west off Westbrook. I think you should be able to make that out. And within the, not the subject property, but the property that was the last one we did, which had the value of $540,000, you can see the dimension of 30.651 meters at the north end. And then at the south end of that property, you can see the dimension of 12.192 meters. And then if you continue going in a southerly direction, on the other side of the jut out, you can see a car parked. And what I want you to gather from that, let's say a car is 20 feet long. What I want you to, and 30 meters, of course, is about 100 feet. What I want you to gather from all that is that there's a significant portion of this property. If you could draw a straight line that was always 30 meters away from the rail embankment, there's a significant portion of this property that will not be buildable. And that's going to impact the value. That's really the point I'm wanting you to draw. And really what that takes us to is that the land value approach, which of course I say is not the appropriate approach, it's also not correct, especially in the context of this property, because of the development restrictions that impact this property. So that's really what I wanted you to take away from this. Again, questionnaires are attached. Mr. Merritt, you have a question. I may as well address it now about the stall count and seasonal and annual. And so what the Gold Eyes do is in the season, the 4 months, they take a portion of this lot and they reserve it and use it for season ticket holders. So as part of the package of season tickets, there's an ability to obtain parking in this lot, which through the tunnel, you can get right into the plaza, to the front gates of the ballpark. That's what it's about. That's my submission.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kupfer, any questions for the applicant?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Looking at your page 25, Mr. Newman, this same table of comparables put together by Altus. So this includes sale price per square foot as one of the analysis metrics, correct?
It does.
And if we were to remove the properties that aren't located in the downtown, the Maryland and Sherbrooke properties, and remove the extreme high here at 126 King, would you agree with me that the meat of the analysis is between about $75 and $130 a foot?
I would agree, but I would say to you, it's important to take into account the purpose for which the properties were purchased. Because again, some of them were purchased as part of a land assembly for further development. And although that but that development includes to some extent in the context, for example, of 433 Main Street. So that was the office building on the corner of Main and Bannatyne. That was converted in part to residential. So that includes the fact that they needed parking. And so they went out and acquired properties to meet their need in that regard. And that includes 170 Bannatyne, which was acquired and that's noted in the notes, was acquired for that purpose, as was 127 Bannatyne. So in many ways, although the use has continued as parking, that's a land assembly to facilitate the conversion of 433 Main. And so I would say the value would be impacted.
Speaking of that value, I believe you concluded $1,272,000 and change for this property. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
So taking that over the 37,221 square feet of the property would come to a land value of around $34 a foot, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Those are all my questions.
Mr. Merritt, do you have any questions for the applicant?
I have no questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Ms. Linklater, do you have any questions?
I also have no questions. Thank you.
Mentioned a few times this afternoon on some of these properties about would anybody build there in some of these lots because of the rail line there. So would you agree that it's quite likely that if somebody was to build something, it'd be an office building here, not an apartment building?
Well, I think it's least likely that it would be an apartment building. A perhaps better use would be a warehouse. But people aren't going to spend the kind of money we're talking about for land to build warehouses. And also warehouses these days are built to a much bigger scale. And certainly these days, and I appreciate that in 10 years things may change, but these days there's zero demand for new office development because of all the vacancy. So I don't think anybody would ever consider an office development economic. And then the last thing I'll say about an office development is you have to pick where you're going to build. And an office development becomes much more valuable if it's connected to the walkway system. It's it's an island, this site, in many ways. It's not connected to the walkway system. It's some distance. If I'm a specific user who's gonna build a building for my own use, maybe. But if I'm building a rental building, I would never build a rental office building in this location. And again, there's lots of land in what I'll call the downtown core. You don't need to go here.
I guess what I'm getting at is having the railway tracks there and noisy trains. Would it be an issue if it wasn't an apartment block, right? If it wasn't a residence, would any owner really care whether there's trains going by? I mean, even in the Forks, there's a rail line going there and that's fine there, right? So, just thought I'd ask.
But they're gonna have to meet the setback requirements as well.
Yeah, okay, so from a set, yeah, but just.
Yeah.
So I guess your statement about it being there is about the setback then, not about the noise of the railway you're in.
Well, it's about both, but I agree with you that if you spend
Yeah.
enough money for soundproofing and construction,
Yeah,
you can deal with noise.
fair enough. I have no further questions. Anything in the summation, Mr. Comfort?
Nothing for me, thank you.
Anything in summation, Mr. Newman?
I'm good, thank you.
That then brings to a conclusion item number 541 Westbrook. We will then proceed to item number 6, file 3227 Mill Street. This is an application for revision of assessed value. Mr. Kupfer, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is roll number 1209-199-2500. The street address is simply Mill Street. This is another property owned by the Canadian National Railway Company and managed by Impark. It's a surface parking lot with a land area of just under 13,000 square feet. And we have a 2025 model-driven assessment using income of $687,000, which I'm going to recommend be confirmed today. Pages 2 and 3 of my brief contain the map and an overhead photo of the subject property. So you can see it is triangular-ish in shape at the confluence of Waterfront Drive and Mill Street. Page 4 of my brief contains the same parking lot rent comparables, which you've seen already today. Page 5 of my brief shows a similar looking workup here. So we have 28 stalls on file for this property, $92 net per stall and a 4.5% capitalization rate. And that's deriving that $687,000 value. I'll take you all the way down to page 9. That's the income and expense mailer submitted by the property owner. Doesn't appear they filled out the stall count, unless I'm reading that wrong. And a net operating income of $3,923. Well, this isn't the correct income and expense mailer. I apologize. This is an expense mailer for a different property, so we'll have to disregard that for this presentation. And then looking on to page 11 are my comparable photos. Again, same comparables, same maps as I've supplied for you for every other income producing or income valued parking lot that we've discussed today. So again, I apologize for having the wrong I&E here. But again, we have a 2025 model-driven assessment of $687,000 using income, and from what I can see, some pretty standard parameters for the area. And I'm open to questions. Thank you.
Mr. Newman, any questions for the assessor?
Mr. Kupfer, I'll just indicate to you that the questionnaires in my brief align with the 28 stalls reflected in your brief, even though the questionnaire is not correct. So I'll tell you that. And again, the calculation on page 5 is completely model driven. Correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay, those are my questions. Thanks.
Mr. Merritt, any questions?
I have none, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Ms. Linklater, any questions?
I have no questions, thank you.
And I have none. Mr. Newman, you may begin your presentation.
So again, similar story to the others, so I won't belabor it. Page 9. The layout of 5 years of revenue and expenses and net operating income. And you can see it has dropped off as the years have gone along, to some extent, especially in 2022. And again, it seems to be a common theme we're seeing that occupancy has dropped off in 22. Nonetheless, I think, quite reasonably stabilized the net operating income at $25,000. If we jump to page 17, page 16, then that becomes a value of $454,000, $454,545. If we look at page 22, there's some additional photos. And I want it to be clearly understood that truly some of this parking is beneath the rail line. And you can see it. You can see it from those photos. Really, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Mr. Kupfer, any questions for the applicant?
I don't see anything new here, Mr. Chairman. I have no questions. Thank you.
Ms. Linklater, any questions?
I have no questions, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Merritt, any questions?
I don't think I do, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
And I have none. Anything in summation, Mr. Kupfer?
Nothing for me. Thank you.
Anything in summation, Mr. Newman?
No, thank you.
That then concludes this property, item 6, file 3227 Mill Street. On to item number 7, 125 Lombard. This is an application for revision of assessed value. Mr. Kupfer, please begin your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is roll number 1306 0690000, and the street address is 125 Lombard Avenue. The owner is R. Thomas Dixon Limited. This is again a commercial surface parking lot. The land area of just over 26,000 square feet, and a 2025 model-driven assessment of $2,502,000 using income. Pages 2 and 3 of my brief, familiar. They show maps and overhead photos of the subject property. So you can see this property is quite well located between McDermott and Lombard, and it is rectangular in shape. We have on file 102 parking stalls, which I believe is confirmed by the income and expense mailer. This property also takes part of my rent comparables table. As you can see, it is comparable number 4 and had reported a net rate per stall for 2022 of $56.61 by our calculation, which is below both the mean and median. Page 5 of my brief shows that income value workup. Again, 102 stalls, $92 per stall, gives us an NOI of $112,608. And then that same 4.5% capitalization rate is being applied, which is how we derive the value $2,502,000. Looking now onto page 9 of my brief, the income and expense mailer lists a net operating income for the reporting period of just over $72,000. By contrast, we have modeled up around $112,000, so our model is higher than what's been reported for 2022. and stall count of 106. Well, we have 102 currently in our model, so I'm not sure what that discrepancy is. They're reporting 4 stalls higher than what we are. And then scrolling down to pages 10 and 11, it doesn't appear that management company is listed here. They don't have in-park or anyone, so I'm left to assume that it's self-managed. I could be incorrect about that. And then looking on to page 13 and onward are the rent comparable photos and maps for our parking lots, including the subject property, as that is comparable number 4 on my list. So with that in mind, again, 2025 model-driven assessment, just over $2.5 million, which I'm recommending be confirmed. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Newman, any questions for the assessor on the presentation?
So, you've noted that it's reporting a net operating, it's one of your comparables at page 4, reporting a net operating income per stall of $56.61 per month. And so the math to get to the net operating income would be, I guess, 106 times 56.61 times 12. Would that be right?
Yes, sir.
And so my calculator says that's about $72,000. Okay. But the model sets the net operating income at $112,000. So,
Correct.
so where's the discrepancy, do you think? Is it in occupancy? Is it in top line revenue? Is that why there's a discrepancy?
Well, many of the lots that we've looked at today have shown that 2022 was the lowest by and large in terms of the operating income obtained by the parking lots. This one is a bit further from the ball diamond, but in the same area. So I would suggest that 2022 was a poor year for this lot. I note a 49% expense ratio, which is actually pretty common. We usually look for around 45 to 55%, so that's pretty bang on. Yeah, beyond that, I haven't done a deeper dive on it.
Okay. All right, but ultimately, page 5, the value is model driven, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Mr. Merritt, any questions?
Just an observation, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cupper, consistency for the model throughout these properties with a cap rate of 4.5%. Very consistent, and you probably hang your hat in regards to the cap rate for these properties at the 4.5%.
I do, yes.
All right. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Linklater, any questions?
I have no questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And I have no questions. Mr. Newman, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you. So again, much of the same story that you've heard. Let's go to page 4 of my brief. It's the story of the demand for parking, fewer people, fewer cars, impact of COVID, remote work, all of those same things we've talked about. Page 7, there's the layout of the 5 years. And you can see there's been a very, very dramatic drop-off of what's happened on this property. And notwithstanding that, I've actually accepted, for purposes of this hearing, the assessor's net operating income of $112,608. It's certainly higher than 21 and 22. Will it come back? Who knows? So that's the uncertainty, that's the instability, that's the risk, and that is all of the reasons why I'm asking for a 5.5% capitalization rate. And at page 14, the value becomes $2,047,000. And again, I say to you simply that we have information to support the capitalization rate analysis. The assessor is working off some unknown model with unknown sales. So I'm asking that you allow the value of $2,047,000. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kupfer, any questions for the applicant?
No questions from me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Linklater, any questions?
I have none. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Merritt, any questions?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
And I have no questions. Anything in summation, Mr. Kupfer?
No, thank you.
Anything in summation, Mr. Newman?
No, thank you.
That then brings to a conclusion this property, item 7, 125 Lombard. We will then proceed to the next property on the docket, item number 8, file 24-3348 Waterfront Drive. This is an application for revision of assessed value. Mr. Kupfer, please begin your presentation.
Thank you, sir. This is roll number 130-960-49200. The street address of simply Waterfront Drive. The owner is a Manitoba corporation there. This is our final surface parking lot of the day. It's quite small, just over 2,100 square feet, encompassing 4 stalls. We have a 2025 modeled assessment of $168,000, which was derived using land. Page 2 of my brief. There is actually a sale on this one. It is quite old, it's back to about 2005, where it looks like it transacted for around $50,000, slightly different sworn value and consideration. I haven't investigated the sale, given that it is quite old. Underneath that, you can see maps and photos of the subject property. This one is right along Waterfront Drive. Page 4 of my brief contains the same, all of the same land sale comparables that I presented you with throughout this docket. Again, the top 3 comparables there are all quite a bit smaller. Granted, even a bit smaller than the subject property. 126 King would be the closest there at 2,650 square feet. The subject property is at about 2,103 square feet. So our model is determined a value of just under $80 per square foot over that 2,103 square feet, which is how we derive $168,000 in assessment. I've included the income and expense mailer for this subject property, despite being on land here, confirming that yes, there are 4 surface stalls, and they've reported a net operating income of just under $2,000 for those 4 stalls throughout 2022. And note that there's no management company listed for this one either, so I'm not sure who runs the day-to-day of the parking lot. And beyond that, starting on my page 11, are simply the comparable photos and maps, which you've been seeing all day. So to summarize, 2025 assessment, $168,000, or just under $80 a foot land value. Thank you very much.
Newman, any questions for the assessor?
Did you investigate whether this land is serviced?
I haven't, no.
Those are my questions. Thank you.
Ms. Linklater, any questions?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Mr. Merritt, any questions?
Just one question, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kupfer, throughout my visit or looking through the property, It talked about being landlocked. Is the property landlocked?
To my knowledge, there appears to be access off waterfront. I'm not sure how people would park there if it were landlocked.
Okay. I thank you. I'll direct the question later to Mr. Newman. Thank you, sir.
Who owns this property? Is it it's not the city of Winnipeg, not the rail line, not the Gold Eyes, just a private owner?
Private owner, yes, that's correct.
And it's a very small lot. So I know this is more of a speculative question. Maybe you could try to answer it, but why would somebody own this land if they're only making $2,000 a year on it?
I would suggest that $2,000 likely isn't the norm, and like many other properties we've seen today, they've had better years, and this is probably the worst one for their reporting.
Okay. I have no further questions. Mr. Newman, maybe get your presentation.
Well, I'll ask rhetorically, picking up on your last question, Mr. Chair. Why would anybody own this property if the income was $6,000? And that's the problem with this property. It's not big enough for anybody to really bother with. And why is it there? Because it's some remnant of land that came out of the reconfiguration and creation of Waterfront Drive. It's a remnant. And so who's gonna buy it? And my answer is, nobody's gonna buy it for development purposes, because what are you gonna put on 2,000 feet? Now, if you're in, if you're in Manhattan and you can get 2,000 square feet of a storefront on Times Square, that might be a very valuable piece of land, because you could put a kiosk or newspapers or whatever. You can put something there with all that foot traffic that will generate revenue. There's no foot traffic here, not much to speak of practically. So who's gonna want this property? And this is, year after year, we come to deal with this property and the value bounces around a little bit. Sometimes it's been over $200,000 and we appeal and it gets knocked back a little. It's not huge one way or the other, but it's this remnant that the only practical use they could figure out for was parking. And so there's 4 stalls on it. Why is it landlocked? Because there's no curb cut to waterfront. That's why. So how do you get to it? The answer is, if you look at my page 16, you can see that this little ramp area is tucked in behind the bushes and the trees. And you get to it because there's an access point that leads into the adjacent building, and that's how you get to it. And it's actually shown better in the assessor's brief. My apologies, I don't have a great picture here. It's shown better in the assessor's brief, but that's why I say it's landlocked. Be that as it may, again, much the same story. And if we jump ahead to my page 8, there's the history of the performance of the property. Yes, 2022 was off again. What I've done is I've selected a net operating income of $6,100. So I'm right at the top of what the property's ever done. And I'm applying the 5.5% capitalization rate. And that's turning into a value of $110,909. And that's what I'm asking you to do. And that's my submission.
Mr. Assessor, any questions for the applicant?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to just ask about our comparables, since we both have this, namely 126 King Street, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the closest in size to the subject property. It's only about 500 square feet larger, and it's sold with about $151 a foot. Is that correct?
Yes, so if I'm looking in your brief now at 126 King. And 126 King is immediately adjacent to the back lane. It's literally right across the street from almost from where I'm sitting right now. But if you come back to William and then you go back towards Bannatyne, the first back lane, 126 King runs parallel to that back lane. And so it's got the benefit of the access off that back lane. And it's got the surrounding bars and restaurants of that part of the Exchange District, as well as Red River College to support the parking demand for it. So from that perspective, it's a more valuable piece of property, I would believe.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Mr. Merritt, any questions for the applicant?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Linklater, any questions for the applicant?
I have none. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And I have none. Anything in summation, Mr. Comfort?
Nothing for me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anything in summation, Mr. Newman?
I'll just in 30 seconds say, you've heard 5 income approaches, you've heard 3 land values. I think you've heard lots from me repeatedly about why income and not land, and even where land development restrictions and things that might impair the ability to do it from a land perspective. I think the income approach is the better approach, the more appropriate approach. Overall, I think I've been quite conservative in the sense that I've set my net operating incomes quite high. Certainly others might have argued for a lesser amount. With that should come the higher capitalization rate. That's my story into it.
Thank you. That then brings the matter of item 8, file 24-3348 Waterfront Drive to a conclusion. And I believe we have heard all of the items on the docket today, so if so therefore we can then adjourn this hearing.
Good evening to everyone.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
Thank you. Comfort.